Okay, great. So I'm going to talk to you about, as discussed, marketing and monetization for games. We're going to focus on what the options are available to you when you do or don't have a budget, and what to consider beyond just simply making the game itself. So as we go in, making games, it's more about just having a great idea or making a fun game. Ultimately, if you're looking to make a career or do something beyond just simply having a hobby, we have to make what's called a successful game. Successful games require as much energy and effort to go into the marketing and the monetization of the game as building the game itself. Simply having a great product, especially in this environment, isn't going to be enough to allow you to do this long term or beyond just a hobby. So really, what does that look like? So you have a great idea that you think people will love, you think they'll play it. That's a fantastic start. You have a plan to build the game. You may have a team in place, you may have a game design doc, strategy to get the game built. But really, what do you need to look at beyond that? Really, the question we're asking here with marketing is, how are you actually going to get players? We simply don't operate in an environment of if you build it, they will come. That's several years beyond where the maturation of the ecosystem is. So then the question becomes, can you launch your game without a budget? The reality is, in this game time and age, you probably cannot pull that off. A budget is going to be required to some degree beyond just the game building itself. So then we talk about, if you do have a budget, if you're considering the budget, really what is that minimum viable budget? What is the lowest amount that you can get to that you can realistically put together for yourself? And really, how much do you need to really get that initial traction? If you're not going to go with a publisher or a partnership, what can you put together yourself? And if you don't have a budget, or if you have a minimum budget, or you can't really hit that minimum viable, what can you do organically to give yourself a better chance to set yourself up? Or to, even if you do have a budget, how can you make that budget stretch as far as it possibly can, knowing that you have to maximize that if you've cobbled it together yourself? So really, in order to look at the organic side of things, you have to understand, what are the bits of information? What sets your game apart? What are the very digestible chunks? We have a very low attention span society now, so you're not going to be able to tell a long story. You're not going to be able to get in front of people in an extremely meaningful way that they're going to give you a lot of their attention. You're not going to get 10, 20, 30 minutes of their attention to watch a big video. So you really need to break it down into chunks. Think about social media posts, right? Tweets, things like that. How can you get unique selling proposition of your game out in very, very small chunks? And then once you've identified what those things that people will pay attention to, what they're going to care about, what's going to catch people's attention, then you can shift into understanding how you're actually going to deliver those pieces of information, how you're going to get those out into the world so that you can get eyeballs onto them. So now we look at a couple of channels. So we have paid and organic. So we'll cover the paid channel. So really, if you do have some of that budget, if you've cobbled that together, how can you maximize those dollars? How can you get that out into the world? First and foremost, your biggest channels are going to be your Facebook and Instagram. These are very mature platforms. They're very sophisticated in what they offer. The targetability of the users, the ability to dial in your bids, understand what is and isn't working, kill campaigns that aren't working, launch test campaigns to find out what does work, is very, very strong on these platforms. So you want to take advantage of Facebook and Instagram. Google is going to be a very strong one as well. Their universal app network, if you're doing a mobile game, the targetability of keywords, what people are actually searching for. These are called hand raisers, people that are actively in market looking for this. And being able to get in front of them is a lot easier than it is to convince someone who's maybe not in the market or paying attention. From there, you go to networks like Twitter. Again, Twitter is very real time. It's very conversational. If someone's talking about something, if there's a keyword in place, you can get in front of them right then and there. So it does make it very valuable. It makes it very relevant at the time. So whenever you're spending money, the closer to the point of interest that you can get, the further that those dollars are going to go for you. And so these networks offer that. From there, we go into cost per install networks. There's plenty of them here as sponsors and things of that nature. So there are networks that are very good about finding players, finding contextual relevancy, being able to connect players with games that they may be interested in. And it's very controllable in the sense that you pay money based on the actual installs of your game. You will need to look at the quality of those installs, what happens post-install in terms of getting people with lifetime value. But these networks do offer a lot of that targetability in a very relevant environment with games. Micro-influencers, this is not going to be your Kim Kardashians or things like that are posting about your games. You're not going to spend your millions of dollars to do that. These are going to be smaller influencers that have very tight networks a couple hundred, maybe a couple thousand, at most tens of thousands of followers. But being able to engage with them, you can spend a couple $100 here and there to get some information about your game out in the world. So it can be very valuable to kind of get that viral effect, kind of seed some of your social activity. There are networks that can be very self-serve. These aren't negotiations you necessarily have to have one-on-one with anybody. And then finally, paid reviews and coverage. So making sure that you're understanding what the PR looks like, getting reviews, getting other people to actually cover your game, talk about your game. No one really wants to be the first one paying attention to the game for the most part. If you go on and you look at a game and it has 0 reviews or no one's really talking about it, you're not going to get as much coverage. So you want to build up that momentum and that activity around. And sometimes paying to seed that initially can kind of start that ball rolling. So outside of paid, what can we look at organically that can seed and help support those games? Organically, it's going to be similar from a social perspective, but you're going to use these networks in a different way organically. With Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and influencers, this is conversational. This is putting out those bits of information that I talked about earlier, making sure that people understand what is the value of a game, what's the unique element of it, what types of players will like it, why did you build it. These are things that will engage people, will pique people's interest, and will get them to explore and look for your game if they hear it being talked about. Influencers is a very interesting network. You can imagine that these have a lot of sway over players, but they're also being inundated by so many people who have the next great game that they really want people to talk about. The problem that you're going to run into with influencers is if the first time you ever reach out to them is to ask them for a favor, say, hey, can you cover my game? You have to understand they don't know you, they don't know anything about you, your game, and you're asking for a pretty big favor. These people put a lot of time and energy and effort into actually developing their networks and their audiences. And there's a lot of value to those. So if you're simply reaching out blindly, you're probably not going to get a lot of response. If influencers is the direction you want to go, you probably want to make those relationships early on. You want to offer value. You want to think about, hey, if I can reach out to this person and offer them something that their audience would be interested in, how can I support that? How can I make that as easy as possible? Keep in mind, you're not doing them a favor necessarily by telling them about your game. They're doing you a favor by covering it. So really approaching it from that perspective. I think a lot of mistakes that a lot of developers and people make is they simply reach out thinking that this person will cover my great game, but you got to think about it from what they're doing for you. Outside of that, going back to Google, so this is going to be search results, hand raisers. So if you have a website, if you have any sort of app store optimization, things like that, you want to find the searchability as people are looking. So your game genre, other sorts of lists, top, if you're doing a match 3 game, your top match 3 games, those types of content. So again, getting in front of people that are looking for this information. YouTube's a great channel. Sight, Sound, and Motion shows off games in a fantastic way. So again, this goes back to the influencers or your own YouTube channels, your previews, anything that can kind of show off your game in a motion capacity will allow you to really show it off in a better way than just simply words in an article or things like that. Public relations, again, this is going to be reaching out to anyone who's covering, writing articles, industry type things, PocketGamer, things like of that nature. You want to build those relationships early on. You want to seed the content. You want to talk about what it is that you're offering, early previews, early access, why you've done this, why you've built it differently. Again, thinking about what you're offering to that network is going to go a long way in this. And then finally, cross-promotion. If you can find other games, other people that may be in your same scenario, that maybe need opportunities to kind of seed players, you can build those relationships, share traffic, share installs, things of that nature. That's going to help you stretch your dollars a lot further in terms of a cross-promotion instead of a straight cost per install. So really, if you're looking at marketing, what are some of the things that you need? So again, those bits of information, what are people going to latch on to? You can have a website. If you have a website, it can show off your game. This is going to be valuable for any sort of public relations or influencers that are going to be developing content about your game. If you have a blog, people can kind of follow along, get invested in your story. So again, from a website, you're not going to get as many players on there, but it's going to offer up the ability for people to cover your game, and that's going to become helpful. In that, you should look at what your press kit involves. So what are the things that people will actually pay attention to about your games? What will they cover if they do decide to give you sort of any time on their channel? What can help them cover your game a little bit easier? That's going to be videos, screenshots, a fact sheet. What are the key bits of information? Logos, icons, artwork, credits, who worked on the game, even writing your own press release. These are all things that make it a lot more easier to get those favors from people. When you're asking for someone to cover it, they don't have to research it. They don't have to spend a lot of time. You've done a lot of that for them. So it's a lot lot easier to get that yes when you're asking for that favor from either the press or an influencer or anything like that. And then finally, if you have the ability, any kind of swag that you have, t-shirts, flyers, people love these things. Even though most of what games are in the digital space, whether it's on phone or computer, it still does operate in the real world, particularly in the mobile environment. People have these devices in their pockets, so any sort of interaction they have in the real world, it's easy for them to pull that phone out of their pocket, download it, and have that access right then and there. So these things can go a long way. You can also get a lot of concentration if you can give these things out at a conference or an event or a school or a class. These are 20, 30, 40 people that you can get coverage of your game all in one place versus having to go one at a time online. So if we assume that we can get these players, we can market, get players to the game, we actually want to make it worthwhile. So we got to look at the monetization, how you're actually going to extract the value of the marketing that you've done. So we're going to look at some of the efforts you could put into game that can yield some of that value so that you can either reinvest in the game or actually just simply have success building them. So from a marketing perspective and a monetization perspective, we're looking at a few different things. IAP is going to be a little bit more relevant from a mobile perspective, but these things translate in other ways as well. So an in-app purchase, this is getting people to make purchases in your game, whether it's power-ups or boosts, unlocked content versus a premium. You can look at time, which is forced waiting, get sort of that delayed gratification with players, lives and energy, paywalls. These are all things that have to fit into your game in a way that it doesn't disrupt the players so much that they can't play, but you can offer the ability to kind of advance or to do things that they may be willing to make those microtransactions against. It's all within the flow of your game. If you're going to assume that less than 5%, closer to 1 or 2% of people will actually ever spend money inside of a game, that's a whole lot of people you have to figure out another way to make money from. Advertising is one of the strongest ways to do that. Again, you don't want it to be disruptive, but you want to find those points in your game that it flows and it fits. In a perfect world, a rewarded video and optional where you're not forcing that advertising, you're actually letting the player choose their way into it. That's going to be the least disruptive. It's going to cause the least attrition to your game. Interstitials, points where it's not going to be too disruptive, you're moving between screens or between elements of your game, can kind of slip in there pretty well. Banners can be a little bit disruptive, but on more static screens, things like pause menus, main menus, things where it's not necessarily going to stop an action, but it's just simply going to be in the background, they can fit fairly well. And then as we talked about before, cross promotion, where can you kind of encourage other players to install and create that trade environment. So if we assume that you've marketed the game, you've got players, that you've actually been able to monetize it, and you've got some investment to put into your game, how do you maximize that? So this is where we get into live ops, ad ops, and analytics. If you've got a successful game, if you're spending money on the game, you really need to understand what's happening in that. You need to collect your data, and you need to understand how to make that data work for you to maximize the yield out of that. Analytics is going to be critical, understanding what are players doing in your game. If you're running ad campaigns, how are those ad campaigns actually yielding results? And where can that be maximized? So you really want to find ways to customize the monetization to user groups. If you have paying players, you want to push actual IAP to them. If you have non-paying players, you want to understand how to segment them out and deliver the right ads at the maximum yield so that you're not leaving any money on the table in any meaningful way. So player segmentation, data collection, this is all going to be very critical to the overall success of what we were doing. So all in all, really, I think what we're looking at is the preparation of making sure that you're going to work harder than you think. Anything you kind of plan out in terms of timelines or expectations or budgets is going to be padded in terms of what you're going to find out in terms of reality. You're definitely going to want to be prepared to learn more than you think you need to. That data is going to be incredibly important to you. Understanding what your player feedback is from the game perspective, understanding what marketing and monetization things are working. All of this you have to be prepared to absorb and actually pivot and do something with as you collect that information. Facing obstacles you never thought of. This could be anything from a team member leaving to burning out money on an influencer you thought would work and didn't come out. But you really need to be able to pivot and shift on those things. They're unexpected, and those obstacles that get in your way, if you're not prepared for that, it can certainly set you back pretty heavily. And then definitely questioning everything along the way. So a lot of times developers will fall into the trap of just thinking they have this great game and it's definitely going to work. But you constantly want to be asking yourself, who is my audience? What are they going to respond to? What is my competition in market? What am I going up against? And if you're constantly asking those questions, you can solve and anticipate ahead of time, and it'll help you in the long run so that you're not blindsided by anything. And then always just keeping in mind that it's very hard to stick with and finish. It's a long process. Building the game is the first step. Again, you have to develop relationships. You have to kind of find out how you're going to market it, how you're going to push it, and what you're going to do to operate the game long term. So really sticking through and finishing it is a big milestone in and of itself. And then understanding that everything's a learning opportunity. That's both the positive and the negative. If you get negative feedback, that's a chance to learn and pivot and understand. If something doesn't go right, it's a chance to evaluate what happened and what we can do differently about that. And really, as I said, finishing is a milestone that most developers won't reach. You get a lot of people that'll try a game, start a game, and kill a game many times, or just simply won't be able to anticipate those types of things. So simply finishing is a major accomplishment in and of itself. But really making sure that if you do go that extra mile, you do finish, you do get to that finish line, that it doesn't go to waste, that you do maximize that opportunity, because you're not going to have that many chances to build a huge commercial successful game. So you really don't want to let that slip through your fingers. So that's everything I have. If you want to cover a few questions.
Thank you very much. This moment always reminds me of my favourite quote from Mythbusters: "Failure is always an option."
Yes.
And that's not a bad thing, by the way. And like you said, saying, this is the learning process. The other favourite quote I have is, "There's only one thing worse than making games, and that's not making games." I'm here for the comedy. I'm not here for any questions. Anyway, the point I think I want to try and ask you more about is, it seems to me what you're trying to get across is, it's identifying the lowest hanging fruit and exploiting that to the maximum effect for the long term. And I think, what I think is interesting is that it's very rare to hear people talking about it as the service part of the process, because quite often we hear people talking about their projects and so on and so forth, but actually talking about this being not about the release, but about what happens next. Yeah. Do you think people understand that? Or, are we still struggling to communicate it?
I think it is an area where there's a little bit of struggle. In terms of the way that the app environment or the game environment works, is it's very momentum based, right? So I think where people fail to realize is that, and it gets talked about a lot, where it's very much a curve. And so as much as you can concentrate, as high as you can raise that initial platform, it's really going to give you a lot more momentum as you sort of trail down on that curve. And that concentration of budget, when you don't have unlimited resources, is you really need to make it work for you. If you're trying to do one thing 1 week and the next thing another week and try and get coverage a month later, you're going to get these little bursts here and there, but you're never going to get high enough to really carry you in any meaningful momentum, which means your budget is only going to stretch so far. If you're limited on resources, really maximizing that lowest hanging fruit, that organic boost and viral factor that you can get out of it, is going to make those dollars go as far as possible. So really strategizing around how you're spending those dollars, not just kind of throwing things against the wall.
No, exactly. And this is why I think books like The Lean Startup or Geoffrey Moore's Crossing the Chasm, those two kind of, I think, are two pivotal books that I found very useful to help my thinking. With Lean Startup, it's obviously looking at what it is you need to make now, not necessarily what you are aiming to build later.
Yeah.
I think that's kind of a key thinking. But also the way Geoffrey Moore talks about kind of the technology adoption life cycle and the gap between the audiences. There's another thing I think a lot of people don't talk about enough, which is the lowest hanging fruit is not necessarily for the long term, it's often for the current audience, and sometimes their needs are different. There's a potential question over there. I'm just going to run over and hopefully not destroy. Well, no, we need the mic for the recording, so I will be 2 secs. I'm just doing this for fitness, by the way.
Thank you. I'm curious, given how delicate a small budget is, and given how precarious ad channels are, do you subscribe to a kind of time to win strategy? The idea of killing your darlings or cutting and run too fast. It seems like everyone's got an opinion that's conflicting. Like, how long do you test creative or test a channel before you move on and double down because your budget's so small?
Absolutely, yeah. So I'll answer it from a perspective of just standard digital marketing and not necessarily just on the game standpoint. I think it's all about reaching statistical relevance on the data you're able to collect, right? So you certainly can collect information that can be misleading if there's anomalies in it. If you're running for a couple of days and you're not seeing success, there simply may be a time decay. You may need to be able to get a certain level of frequency in front of people before they recognize the game and will download it. So if you're running an ad campaign and your average person has only seen your ad one time, that may not be that they're not interested in the ad. It just may need to be that they need to see it 2, 3, or 4 times before they really will recognize, or they're at a place where they're ready to make that decision. So it's all about understanding how far your budget can stretch in terms of the data collection, and at what point the data gives you the ability to make an actionable decision. It's hard to give a rough sort of rule of thumb to always follow, but that's the strategy you've got to think through, is at what point have I gotten enough information in terms of the number of people I've reached and how frequently I've reached them to where I truly believe that they're not responding to this message versus I'm able to simply kind of push through. I know that's not a direct answer to the question, but there is just no rule of thumb. If you're spending $100, you may have a shorter time frame. You may have to make more committed decisions and stick to them than if you have $100,000. So it's really just understanding at what point you really believe that response is going to happen, and when you feel comfortable kind of making those transitions. But I would say that once you've reached a point where you have any reasonable expectation of the data being significant, don't be afraid to act on it. Once you understand, hey, this information looks to be information that I can actually take action on, go ahead and act on it at that point.
Yeah, and if the action doesn't have the effect you predict, then you've probably got a good reason to stop.
I will say, as much as you can with your budget, always be testing. Test as much as you possibly can. Don't assume any one thing.
And on that note, thank you again.
Thank you.